Little Shell. The story for the adults and for children. On the edge of the palm groves, touching the white sandy beach, veiled in the breadth of the emerald sea, there was a little village. Every day on the beach, men spread their nets of blue and green and mended them. Then they pushed the big fat boats to the sea and navigated far away. When the dusk saw the last light of the day, women came to the shore, and shadowing their eyes with their hands, they watched the men approaching the land. In their boats shone the huge bright bellies of fish, in the nets tangled rest the shells and lobsters. Then came a village outsider one day. He walked a little girl. She called him father. He mended their nets and fixed the boats for the men. He stayed on the shore when the men left for the sea. He lived with this little girl in that abandoned hut where once lived an old woman whose children deserted her when they left to seek fortune in the faraway towns. The outsider called his daughter Little Shell. He joked that he found her in the beach. The little girl was full of life, and she was such a fun-loving child, but she grew very slowly, as though she did not like to grow into an adult. One morning, after a night of terrible storm, the outsider did not come out of the hut to mend nets. It was clear that he died. Little Shell took over the mending job after her father. The men allowed her, because apparently she had no other means of living. Also, they did not mind her working with them, because they liked to listen to her songs. She sang about the villages and towns far away, and about the different seas and different people. Women watched her with pity, wondering what can grow out of her. So thin was she, so tiny, with such a face. Sometimes they gave her some hot rice wrapped in banana leaf. Sometimes she got something from them to wear. However, nobody popped into her hut. Nobody invited her home. Nobody hugged her or caressed her hair. Nobody said to her when the night grew, "Stay with us." Little Shell walked to the beach when fishermen were disappearing behind the mountainous waves. In the places where water of the Emerald Sea became still for a moment, she looked at her reflection of her face. She blamed her face for her loneliness, for not being loved by anybody, all because of the face. Talking to the shells, she sat on the beach until the return of the men. The most beautiful shells she took home with her. The music of the shells lulled her to sleep. She loved to make necklaces with shells and offered them to the women. She told them that wearing shell necklaces would bring them happiness, and that they always looked pretty wearing them. One day she found a big pink shell on the beach. The same night she saw a beautiful underwater kingdom full of shell trees and shell flowers, with the castle made of pink shells and underwater shell people, and even a shell king and shell queen. The following nights the dream kept coming back to her, until one night she saw great sadness in the shell kingdom. She woke up hearing somebody crying quietly beside her. She stretched her hand towards the voice and touched the big pink shell lying beside her. In the morning, when she sang to the fishermen while mending the nets, she heard the same cry somewhere in the waves. Surprised, she stopped singing abruptly. "Hey, little shell, don't be mean. Sing some more," shouted the man. "Don't you hear someone crying there in the sea?" she replied. They laughed at her. What had occurred in her mind? She sang to them about that underwater shell kingdom she dreamed. "Where do you know it from, orphan?" asked they. "The big pink shell whispers it to me every night." Again they laughed and laughed. One day, when the fishermen left for the sea, and the women got busy with washing and quarreling, Little Shell took big pink shell with her and as usual went to the beach. She waved to the women from the distance, and they did not know yet that it was the sign of farewell. Little Shell approached the sea. It gently washed her feet. She made a few more steps, and the sea washed her legs. She held the big pink shell close to her heart. She wanted the big pink shell to take her to its underwater shell kingdom, about which she heard every night. She walked further and further, and the sea washed her hands, her shoulders, her eyes, her hair. When Little Shell woke up, she saw herself surrounded by the Little Shell people. Among them stood a beautiful princess, the big pink shell. They all clapped their hands when they saw her eyes open. The big pink shell took her to the shell castle, where the king and the queen welcomed her to the shell kingdom. They thanked her for the return of their daughter, the princess. They told her that knowing her great love for shells, they accepted her as one among them. Since then, Little Shell has been living in the Shell Kingdom happily, joyfully, and loved by all. Day by day, she looked prettier and prettier. Her hair was decorated with shells. She wore a pearl shell dress, slept in bed made of the finest shell dust. She played with the big pink shell and plenty of other smaller ones in the shell castle and its coral park. Then one day, while playing with the big pink shell among the colorful fish, she swam up to the surface of water. She saw fishermen mending their nets on the shore. Somebody sighed, "Ah, if Little Shell were here, she would sing for us." From then on, Little Shell made it a habit to swim up to the surface every day. Once she heard the women saying, "Ah, so long she lived with us, being a little child. None of us took her home." They touched their necklaces with sadness in the eyes. Next morning, when the crimson light of the rising sun colored the sea, Little Shell said goodbye to the Shell King and the Shell Queen and to the all Shell people. She begged them to understand that she missed her village and its people, just as the big pink shell missed her people once. So she wanted to return to them. Little Shell appeared on the shore before fishermen gathered to spread their nets of blue and green. She sat by the big fat boats, looking at the huts under the palm trees. She began to sing. Women opened the doors, men rushed out surprised. "Little Shell is back!" All shouted with joy, and clapping their hands, they ran to the beach. Little Shell lived happily thereafter. Sometimes, when the rising sun was still shaking off water after the sea baths, one could see the big pink shell rocking on the waves. She would disappear only after she could hear Little Shell singing and watch her sending her kisses.